Hey guys, it's Mr. Schmidt here, and in this video we're going to define GDP or gross domestic product. In the last video, when we talked about macroeconomics, we said that one of the goals of macro is to determine how the economy is currently doing. And this is very similar to like when you go to the doctor's office and they run some tests on you to see how you're doing and how your general health is. That is very similar to what we're going to do over the next several videos in terms of assessing the macroeconomy's health. And so we look at these things called indicators. And these indicators indicate or tell us how an economy is doing. And there are three major macroeconomic indicators. And the one we're going to focus on in the next handful of videos here is GDP or gross domestic product. So what I want to do in this video in particular is just basically explain what GDP is. And so we're going to take what is a fairly long definition and break it into parts so we really understand what we mean by gross domestic product. So first of all, GDP or gross domestic product, and I'll go ahead and write that out in full here just so you have that, gross domestic product. It is the total value. So GDP is measured in dollars. It's a value of something and we measure it in dollars. So make sure you have the dollar sign anytime you are quoting a GDP. Total value measured in dollars, and it tends to be measured in dollars around the world so that there's an easy point of comparison between countries' GDP. Second, it is the total value of all final goods and services. So first of all, GDP, when you think of GDP, I want you to think of output, right? And we've talked about output a lot in microeconomics. We called it total product, quantity, right? But in those cases, we were looking at one firm, one industry. Here, we're looking at the total output of all the industries put together, the total output of the entire country. And so that's the distinction here. Also, you'll note that I say all final goods and services. So what does that mean? GDP only measures the value of finished or completed products. It does not include the value of what we would call intermediate goods or the parts of that completed product. So for example, if we are including the value of a car in GDP, the price tag of the car that you would see on the lot at a dealership would be included in GDP. But the value of the tires, which is a part of the car, would not be included, right? And so the question is, why is that? Well, let's say you have a car and it costs, $15,000, okay? In that $15,000 price tag is included the value of the tires, right? But if you count those in addition to the car, what ends up happening is, let's say the tires cost $800 put together. That means you're valuing the car at $23,000, which is more than what the price tag actually was. And so we don't want to basically double count anything and overstate or inflate GDP. We want to get an accurate reading of gross domestic product. And so we only include final or finished goods and services. So GDP is the total value of all final goods and services produced within a country. GDP measures production within the country's borders. Anything that's produced inside the country's borders is included. So for example, we could have a foreign company like Honda here, and let's say they make a car, and they make that car inside the United States. So it would count for the United States GDP, even though Honda here is a company that's located in Japan, outside of the United States. But the car itself, if the actual car gets made in the United States, doesn't matter by who, so long as it's made in the United States, it's included in the United States GDP. And the opposite would also be true. So, for example, if you have an American company like GM, and let's say they make a car, and that car is made in Japan, then guess what? It would be included in Japan's GDP. And so you just have to be careful because sometimes students get confused because they want to think about where or what country the producer's from. That doesn't matter. All that matters is where is it being made? Where is it actually being produced? Whatever country can claim that it's being produced there, that is who gets the credit or gets the value that gets added to GDP. And then finally, GDP is measured in terms of annual economic performance. So we measure it in 1 year, and then we compare year to year to see if there's growth or decline in economic total output. So GDP is the total value, measured in dollars, of all final goods and services, so all finished products, produced within a country's borders, so anything produced inside the country, doesn't matter who's producing it, in 1 year, looking at annual performance. That's GDP. And everything in that definition matters. So it's important, review the definition, make sure we understand it inside and out. Because GDP is such an important indicator, and we're going to be talking about it a lot over the next several units. And so it's important we understand it completely. Finally, I want to mention a couple categories here of things that are not included in GDP. The first one we've already kind of talked about, which is intermediate goods. So goods that are used to make another good, for example, the tires that became part of the car, are not included in GDP. And the reason is simple, because we don't want to count the tires twice. We've already counted them when we quote the price tag of the car, so we don't want to include them here before they are attached to the car. Second are what we call non-production transactions, so things like stocks, bonds, and used goods. So why? Well, for the case of stocks and bonds, it's because there's nothing of value being produced. Remember, GDP represents output. If all we're doing is moving money around, right, through a stock or a bond, or we talked about this, I believe in Unit 9, transfer payments, when the government just gives money to consumers through like a stimulus check or something like that, that's not producing anything, and so it's not included in GDP. Remember, GDP is gross domestic product. We have to be producing something. And then used goods are not counted because they've already been counted in a previous year, right? Whatever year is the year when the good is new, that is the year in which it's counted. So if you go into a Goodwill, everything in that Goodwill that they're selling is not included in this year's GDP because it's used. It's old. It's been counted in past years. And so if we were to count it again, we'd be double counting, just like with intermediate goods. And then finally, anything that's non-market or illegal would not be included either. So for example, things like homemade goods, right? It's hard to track that. It's hard for the government to track that. It's hard to know the value of those types of things. Unpaid work, so if you volunteer somewhere, that's not included because how do you assess the value of that? Black market drugs or anything that's illegal that the government doesn't want to include to encourage its production, all of that is not included in GDP. So that's all for this video on defining GDP. Until next time, have a great day.